So, yeah, these stories, they pop up, and the way I look at it is they're like fruit flies. They're designed to have very short lives. They live for a few minutes in the news cycle. They produce just enough to keep the story going, and then they fall apart a couple of days or weeks later. And I've been keeping the list since the beginning of this whole phenomenon. I've got over 50 stories that have been walked back or retracted since the beginning of this whole business. Everything from the 17 agencies agreed story, which turned out to be 4, to Russians hacked the Vermont utility, to the idea that Paul Manafort was working on an editorial with a Russian official while under house arrest. Like, there's so many of these stories that we typically don't do is we don't go back and say, yeah, that wasn't true.
Hey everybody, welcome to the 167th episode of Primo Nutmeg. On today's show, journalist Matt Taibbi is back. We are going to talk about the 2020 election, and specifically Bernie Sanders and Tulsi Gabbard. We're also going to go in depth on the implosion of the Russiagate narrative, and we're also going to talk about social media censorship, including the deplatforming of Alex Jones. Folks, you aren't going to want to miss 1 minute of this interview with Matt Taibbi here on Primo Nutmeg. Just a reminder that all March long we're having our biggest guests back. Yes, some of the biggest guests in Primo Nutmeg history are returning for Megastar March. Subscribe to Primo Nutmeg on YouTube, iTunes, SoundCloud, or Spotify. And help keep the show going by becoming a patron for only $1 a month at patreon.com/Primo Nutmeg. Thanks everyone for listening, and now without any further ado, here's my Megastar March interview with Matt Taibbi. Matt Taibbi, welcome back to Primo Nutmeg.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thank you for being back on. As I was just mentioning, I'm having some of my biggest guests back on the show this March, so it's really an honor to have you back on the show. And you, of course, are a political writer. You write for Rolling Stone. And because of that, and because the 2020 election is heating up, I wanted to ask you what your early thoughts are, especially with Bernie Sanders' event this past weekend in Brooklyn. Is he really the front runner in the race so far?
Well, he's one of them. I think no matter how you slice the race, it's going to come down to Bernie versus whoever represents the Clinton wing of the party. I think the party is basically in schism, and that divide is very powerful. And the other side of the party, it really depends on how they manage things, because from my point of view, the gigantic size of the field works very much in the favor of Sanders. It's similar to the situation with the Republican primary last time around, when you had one candidate who had a very enthusiastic and basically insoluble base of support, and too many opponents who took votes from each other. If I had to bet right now, I would say, he looks like he's going to be the front runner, but it's just it would be such an unprecedented thing for him to actually win the nomination that it's just hard to imagine. But right now, yes.
Why do you think it is that his message is connecting? Because democratic socialism or sort of a general left-wing philosophy has always been, kind of popular among the base and among, obviously younger folks in the party. I'm sure that was the case, back in the 60s and 70s. Why do you think it is now that it's finally reaching a breaking point where you can have somebody who calls himself a democratic socialist actually possibly win the nomination?
To me, it's very similar to what happened with the Republicans last time. Eventually, if you don't perform for the vast majority of your voters, sooner or later they're going to bail on you. And what happened to the Republicans in 2016, I think a lot of people misunderstood what happened there. I think they saw it as this very enthusiastic, unstoppable uprising of Donald Trump. It really wasn't that at all. And I know this because I covered his whole campaign. He was really puttering along between 17 and 25% for much of the early campaign. And just like everybody predicted, all the pointy-headed pundits in Washington. They all predicted that these protest candidates eventually fall back to the pack and people move to the real candidate after that. Well, that moment happened in like October of 2015, where he started to slip a little bit. But the real problem was nobody could back Jeb Bush. They couldn't get behind the party-approved candidate. They were done with the party at that point. And the only people who rose at that moment were Ben Carson and Carly Fiorina, who also weren't politicians. So there's a moment of saturation where people just get tired of hearing the same old promises from people in power. And I think we're close to that breaking point on the Democratic side too, which is why Sanders, whose politics are more or less identical to what Dennis Kucinich's would have been back in 2004, suddenly that's not a fringe candidate. Suddenly that's this huge, unstoppable fundraising phenomenon. And that's as much a reflection of the discontent towards the political establishment as it is, an endorsement of Sanders himself.
The way that I read it, Bernie Sanders really seems to be the left-wing candidate in terms of domestic policy, but it seems like there are certain times when he seems slightly hawkish on foreign policy, and it seems that Tulsi Gabbard is really capitalizing on that and being the I don't know if you want to say left wing, but the peace candidate in the Democratic Party. That's at least how she's positioning herself. So what's your take on the Tulsi Gabbard campaign and how she'll fit into this 2020 primary process?
That's an interesting observation. Having known Bernie a while, I don't think it's that he's hawkish. I think it's more that he's just not as interested in foreign policy, and he tends not to be as aggressive in talking about foreign affairs because that's not his intellectual comfort zone. He's much more interested in talking about things like income inequality and corporate overreach and that sort of thing. That may very well leave room for people like Tulsi Gabbard to get her message across. And that's very, very interesting because you saw the incredibly hostile reaction that the commercial press had toward Gabbard from the very start. And that's because her politics are a complete anathema to the bipartisan consensus in Washington. Like, the one thing you can't be is a pacifist in Washington. Yeah, so she may very well get a lot of its support, but the press attention is going to be very, very negative, I think, as long as she continues in the race.
I guess I kind of wonder how it'll play out in the left wing of the party, because there was an instance a week or two ago when Bernie Sanders tweeted about Venezuela. And what he said was, the people of Venezuela are enduring a serious humanitarian crisis. The Maduro government must put the needs of its people first, allow humanitarian aid into the country, and refrain from violence against protesters. And there were a lot of left-wing folks out there, Max Blumenthal, Abby Martin, many others who kind of, I don't want to say took offense, but were a little disappointed in Bernie about this. And one of them actually was Roger Waters from Pink Floyd. His response was, "Bernie, are you effing kidding me? If you buy the Trump, Bolton, Abrams, Rubio line, quote, humanitarian intervention, and collude in the destruction of Venezuela, you cannot be a credible candidate for president of the USA. Or maybe you can, maybe you're the perfect stooge for the 1%. So it seems like there is sort of a door open where on the far left, or at least, people who are more concerned about foreign policy, some of Bernie Sanders' statements, at least in regards to Venezuela, it could be a little damaging to him, no?
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't love that tweet either. I think the political consensus in Washington, it's amazing how instantaneously everybody forgets how much they despise everything that Donald Trump stands for when the opportunity presents itself for a regime change somewhere in an oil-rich country. Suddenly there's, everybody's in agreement, and it's kumbaya in Washington, and everybody wants to get behind this quote-unquote humanitarian effort to remove Maduro. It's the same script that we've seen over and over again. And that wasn't a great moment for Bernie, I don't think. I think he is maybe a bit of a prisoner of his own success at the moment. I think he's saying things that he may not have in the past because he might be concerned about the damage that it's doing to his now suddenly very real chances at the nomination, which would be disappointing if true. I don't know. I haven't talked to him about it, so it's tough. It's tough to know exactly what's going on there.
And similar to that, Bernie has also seemed to kind of gone along with the general narrative that Russia interfered in the 2016 election, which again, I always found kind of funny because even if that were the case, a big part of the claim is that what they did or WikiLeaks did or whoever released all these emails did was show that the DNC was colluding with the Hillary Clinton campaign against him. So you think if anyone would be more upset at the DNC, it would be him. But he seems to have gone along with the whole Russiagate narrative.
It's very confusing because one of the developments in Russiagate over the past year or so has been, if you go back and you look at the very first story that really came out about Russiagate, which was, this is embarrassing that I remember this, it was July 7th, 2016 in Slate magazine by Franklin Foer. And it was called Putin's Puppet. And the thesis of it was the same thesis that was in the Steele report, which was that Putin was surreptitiously backing right-wing movements all over the world and trying to influence politics that way. When the story developed, and after Trump got elected, there was suddenly an expansion of this theme, and now Putin's hand was to be seen everywhere in the right and the left. It was pushing Black Lives Matter protests. It was, trying to help Jeremy Corbyn get into power in England. And significantly, it was claimed that Russia was trying to advance the Bernie Sanders cause. There was even a story in the Washington Post in November of 2017 that said, it said, what will Democrats do when Vladimir Putin tries to get Bernie Sanders into office in 2020? In other words, they openly called Sanders the Putin-backed candidate. And I guess part of me would have expected Bernie to push back on this a little bit, but look, Russiagate is an incredibly dicey subject for politicians. It's been very conspicuous that even though Bernie has paid lip service to it, he's not up there like Adam Schiff, demanding to know how many Putinites are in the Department of Agriculture or whatever it is. He's kind of been mute about it, but is that good enough? I don't know. It's tough. I mean, it's a very, very difficult situation, and you understand politically why he wouldn't go there. But Bernie's rep is that he doesn't care about the politics. So.
And just to go back to Tulsi Gabbard for a minute, did you also see that NBC News article, which actually came out just a few hours before she officially announced her candidacy, that Russia was going to be supporting her campaign?
Oh yeah, of course I saw that. I mean, that was an incredibly overt and just repulsive act of kind of journalism, and it doesn't have anything to do with anything except that she's on the wrong side of the Syria issue as far as the Washington consensus goes. So this is this propagandistic syllogism that's being employed everywhere. If you are not on the side of what we consider the anti-Russian mandate in Washington, if you have any kind of overlap with what we consider to be the Putin side of the equation, we're going to accuse you of being in league with Putin. If you're not down with us occupying Syria, you're for Putin. It's not just that you're a pacifist, you're for Putin. It's incredible to me that MSNBC, which markets itself as a liberal network, is pushing stuff like that, but they do. And, that's the world we live in now.
Well, one of the most fascinating things that came out about this was when Glenn Greenwald wrote a response about it in The Intercept. He exposed something, and I just want to read a quote from that article. He says, "What NBC amazingly concealed is a fact that reveals its article to be journalistic fraud. That same firm, New Knowledge, was caught just 6 weeks ago engaging in a massive scam to create fictitious Russian troll accounts on Facebook and Twitter in order to claim that the Kremlin was working to defeat Democratic Senate nominee Doug Jones in Alabama. The New York Times, when exposing the scam, quoted a New Knowledge report that boasted of its fabrications. Quote, "We orchestrated an elaborate false flag operation that planted the idea that the Roy Moore campaign was amplified on social media by a Russian botnet," end quote. And, that was really fascinating to me because I had missed that first article and didn't pick up on it until this, after the Tulsi Gabbard hit piece. And you figure that would be bigger news, that that there's people out there actually trying to create fake evidence about Russian interference that doesn't actually exist.
It's amazing that story didn't get more traction. I was actually surprised that the Times sort of went against its own narrative there and actually did that story. I think that was Scott Shane, if I'm not mistaken, right? Was the reporter on that? But yeah, no, that whole business with new knowledge, synthesizing Russian activity in the Roy Moore race, that should have been a much bigger story. I mean, this is essentially the same people that are involved with, the sort of Hamilton 68 stuff, and they're the people who are creating the web infrastructure, that tool that allows you to sort of track Russian influence worldwide, and it's been responsible for all sorts of headlines about Russians being involved in, the Parkland shooting and, all kinds of things, in the Nunes report. And now it comes out that they're faking Russian influence operations. I mean, it's almost too ridiculous to even believe, but they've admitted it. So what do you do with that? It's incredible to me that didn't have more of an impact on the momentum of the Russiagate story.
Well, it seems like nothing really does, right? I mean, because you also had that BuzzFeed article that was retracted. You've had a lot of really outrageous claims that have come out and then just sort of been forgotten about. One of those came out in Cohen's, actually a couple came out during Cohen's testimony before Congress last week, when he said he never had been to Prague. He also said that he has no direct evidence of Russia colluding with Trump. And the one thing that he's saying that I guess is being used to prop up the Russiagate narrative is that Roger Stone told Donald Trump that he had advanced knowledge about the emails being released before they were released. But the silly thing about that as well is that WikiLeaks was actually publicly acknowledging that they were going to release that before Stone ever told Trump, right?
Right, yeah. No, I tweeted about this. If you're reading between the lines of that and you know about how Roger Stone operates, the dynamics there are probably somebody asked Stone to keep tabs on what's coming out about Hillary. And Stone proffered that he had some kind of connection to WikiLeaks, which, isn't necessarily hard to do. They've got a Twitter site and people do respond if you message them. But it's public knowledge that they're going to come out with something. They've been teasing it for a while now. And probably none of the morons in that room had any clue about that. And you could easily see a situation where Stone just says, yeah, no, my inside sources say it's coming out soon. When in fact, as it turns out, and we know this because it wasn't even alleged in Mueller's indictment of Stone that he had any kind of contact with WikiLeaks before that moment. They didn't allege that there was a phone call with Assange, which is part of Cohen's testimony. Assange is the most surveilled person on earth. If there had been a phone call, we would have known about it, but that's not in the indictment. So, yeah, these stories, they pop up, and the way I look at it is they're like fruit flies. They're designed to have very short lives. They live for a few minutes in the news cycle. They produce just enough to keep the story going, and then they fall apart a couple of days or weeks later. And I've been keeping the list since the beginning of this whole phenomenon. I've got over 50 stories that have been walked back or retracted since the beginning of this whole business. Everything from the 17 agencies agreed story, which turned out to be 4, to Russians hacked the Vermont utility, to the idea that Paul Manafort was working on an editorial with a Russian official while under house arrest. There's so many of these stories that we typically don't do is we don't go back and say, yeah, that wasn't true. The retractions tend to take place in conservative media, which is where none of the liberal audience sees. So it's just amazing. You just can't dent the story. It's impossible.
And it is funny because the retractions don't get much airplay. You have a lot of, kind of centrist folks out there who don't really pay attention that much to the news, just being bombarded with the weight of the accusations and thinking, wow, this is really damning. There's a lot there, but they never see the other side of the coin where, all of this seems to just sort of be smoke and mirrors.
And some of it's just clear journalistic malpractice as far as I'm concerned. I mean, Greg Miller, I think he won a Pulitzer Prize, if I'm not mistaken, for the Washington Post. He wrote a book. and he went to Prague, and he had a team of reporters from the Washington Post, and he said that we went to every hotel. I'm going to find this quote for you. I got it right here. He said we went to every hotel. We sent reporters to every hotel in Prague, all over the place, just to try to figure out if he was ever here, and we came away empty. But that story never made it to the Washington Post. It was only picked up in the Daily Caller after C-SPAN happened to broadcast the speech that he gave about his book. Bob Woodward says, I didn't find evidence of espionage or collusion. That didn't come out in any of the publicity about his book about the Trump administration. It only came out in an interview with Hugh Hewitt. so all this stuff that's positive is out there, but it's not. It's in places where people who are centrists for the most part, who watch MSNBC, read the New York Times, the Washington Post, they don't see any of it, so they don't know, which is incredibly frustrating.
Did The Guardian ever walk back their claim that Manafort had met with Assange?
No, they put out, if I'm not mistaken, a kind of a sort of softening language. A couple of days later, they started adding words like "according to," as they toned it down a little bit.
Didn't they edit the article without announcing that they were doing that?
Yeah, which that happens. I'm not going to say that that's 1,000% unethical. It's a little weird when you fundamentally change the meaning of the story.
Right.
But in this case, what they were clearly trying to do was sort of dull the aggressive tone of we know about this. And that story had a profound impact. As a result of that story, and this actually hasn't come out yet. I'm sort of working on the reporting of this now, but the United States, we send investigators to interview all the personnel at the Ecuadorian embassy to try to get information that meeting ever happened between Assange and Manafort. So that story, which was based on God knows what source, and it seems so unlikely. I mean, it's not that it's impossible, but the idea that, again, Julian Assange is the most watched person on human Earth, on the planet. If Paul Manafort had walked into that embassy at any point in recent history, there would have been written records of it. There would have been CCTV footage in London, and none of that has popped up now. Now they haven't retracted the story, which by itself is a little weird, but it had an impact nonetheless, and most people don't know yet to distrust it.
Well, the thing about Cohen being in Prague was that his cell phone was being pinged there, or it was giving a signal from Prague, right?
Well, that was one version of the story. The other version was that somebody mistook one Michael Cohen for another, and so that had something to do with somebody by that name with a passport just being in the city. Look, this all gets back to the same root problem, which is the Steele report was not prepared by a journalist. It was prepared by a private opposition researcher who had an intelligence background. And what do those people do? They compile raw rumors. They put them into a big document. Now, in theory, you definitely want your intelligence to be as accurate as possible, but there's no, you're going to get fired or sued if you put an unfounded rumor in an intelligence document. So he prepares this whole thing that's got all this wild stuff in it, the idiot Carter Page supposedly getting offered a 19% stake in a $63 billion oil company if he could get Russia to overturn sanctions. I mean, that claim was actually repeated by Adam Schiff in his opening statement in the House. And I was so stunned watching that I contacted Schiff's office and I said, did you guys do anything to try to check or verify any of the stuff in the Steele report before you said that? And they're like, no, we look forward to talking to Mr. Steele and to try to substantiate or refute his alibi. In other words, they didn't investigate it before they said it. And this is what everybody is doing. The Steele report is like the Magna Carta of this whole thing, and its core allegations we can't reproduce the results independently in a lab because we don't know what the sources are. So it's all been a trick. It's a journalistic end run. This is the kind of thing that short sellers do. if you're betting against a stock, you get an investment bank to do a negative research report, and you hand that to the FBI, and then as soon as the FBI takes it, you tell a reporter, oh, it's under investigation. The company's under investigation. That gets published. The stock goes down. Everybody wins. It's an old trick, this stuff. The same you do it in politics, too. Bob Menendez in New Jersey. It happened with Whitewater. All this stuff is driven by unconfirmed private research reports, which you can't publish unless you're talking about who's receiving the reports, right? You can say the FBI is investigating. You can say somebody looked at it, and that gets you around the problem of the core allegations being confirmed.
Well, let me ask you for your prediction. Again, just because this has been going on for 2 years and there's so much to it now, right? I mean, Russiagate isn't even really one claim anymore. It's this big involved thing where, some of it is real and provable, where people like Manafort and Cohen are making false statements and doing, tax fraud and stuff like that. Then you have weird kind of meetings like at Trump Tower. Then you have the accusations around Russian trolling. Then you have, the WikiLeaks email dump versus the other email dump, the Gusheford 2.0 dump. So there's just so much to it. And again, it's hard to even tackle it all. But what I wonder is, as somebody who's been paying attention to it for 2 years, what are your thoughts on how this is going to develop over time? Is there going to be any kind of eventual resolution to it? Is it going to just kind of fold into some kind of, larger Russia hysteria where they're going to say Russia interfered in the 2020 election? Is it going to kind of maybe get shuffled aside if Donald Trump does get indicted or impeached for some other sort of related crime, maybe, around Stormy Daniels or, campaign funds or something like that? What's your visceral thought on how this is going to play out over the next, several weeks, months, or years?
I think everybody's too invested in it for it to just suddenly die out and have everybody say, "Oops, sorry, we were wrong." That's not going to happen. Just let's look in the past at a couple of other media disinformation campaigns that took on lives of their own and for political reasons couldn't just die, right? So Whitewater again was a similar story on a smaller scale, but it started in one place and moved to another, and it turned into a special prosecutor investigation, and it became a story about Monica Lewinsky, and then it became an impeachment, and by the time everybody was done with it, and it wasn't really done until Clinton left office, it had taken up 6 years of our lives, and I think that's likely to be the situation here. This is going to be a political battle that's going to continue as long as Trump's in office. And if they don't have the core collusion argument to go with, they're going to go with something involving Deutsche Bank. That they've already previewed the idea that this is the end of the beginning, and that they're going to move into the financial matters, and that's what's really important. The other example is the WMD example, where there was a year and a half, 2 years of just relentless propaganda about Saddam Hussein having weapons. We go there, it starts to look likely that was all fake, but of course our presence in the Middle East doesn't really ratchet down at any point. In fact, we've expanded it significantly since then, even though we're not really at war in Iraq in the same way. So it's going to morph into something else. No one's ever going to say, "I'm sorry." None of the reporters who got it wrong are going to get in trouble, and it's just going to keep going.
That's kind of sad, though, isn't it? I mean, I don't know if you want to name names, but I will. When you have people like Rachel Maddow and Chuck Todd, and I guess to some degree Wolf Blitzer, these folks who are out there constantly saying or suggesting that there's proof that the president of the United States is a Manchurian candidate, and having that also help create and perpetuate a new Cold War, which really puts all of humanity at risk to some degree.
Totally.
Don't you think that there really should be some consequences for that, right? I mean, shouldn't people eventually look to these talking heads and say, I can't believe what you're saying because you've been spouting a insane conspiracy theory for the last couple of years?
It doesn't work like that, though. The only time anybody ever gets in trouble in this business for being wrong is when they're the only one saying it. So again, to go back to the WMD example, most of the people who were trumpeting that story, on the say-so basically of unnamed sources, their careers continued. David Remnick was pushing that stuff in the New Yorker, Jeffrey Goldberg in the Atlantic. All the CNN people were pushing it, the MSNBC, Chris Matthews talked about how, everybody loved George Bush because, everybody loves a tough guy and a winner. And that whole crew, from all of the pundits, Thomas Friedman, they all bought it. All the politicians too. They all got it. They all rode that same horse, and nothing happened to any of their careers because they were all wrong together, right? So that's the key thing here. And a lot of those same people are involved in this caper, which is, I think, many orders of magnitude more stupid than the previous one. And there's not going to be any consequence.
And, going along with that, I think that there's also been a consequence for a lot of independent content creators out there, in questioning any sort of Russiagate narrative or just, establishment dogma to any degree. You saw it this past fall, there was a quote unquote purge by Facebook and Twitter acting together to get rid of a bunch of different pages, the Free Thought Project, the Anti-Media. There was several others. And then also we saw this recently with some news outlets that are funded by Russia, like in the
Rania Halek, yeah.
Right. Even though they hadn't broken any Facebook rules, it seems like there was pressure from CNN on Facebook to ban their page. I don't know. Do you see that letting up at all? I mean, especially so, as Russiagate kind of fades into the background or changes or whatever happens there, and we move further and further away from 2016. Do you see the censorship dying down at all, or do you think it's just going to continue on?
So I did a big feature in Rolling Stone about this, because when I first started seeing that, I thought, wow, that's like a very serious development, especially for people in our business. Because essentially what they were doing is it was a national security argument. They were saying this Russiagate thing is so bad that we now need to have a direct lever over who gets to have, a voice in the press and who doesn't. And, we're going to look to groups like the Atlantic Council, which is basically like a think tank arm of NATO, to advise organizations like Facebook about which sites are foreign influenced, and they should just be sort of removed. And so, yeah, they purged 800 sites, and I think it was October. And there have been sort of periodic zappings across various internet platforms ever since then. And I did that story, and I was amazed by the reaction from my colleagues who were like, yeah, whatever. I'm like, we're in this business. That could be us next. How could you, and the thing that was really revealing is that nobody who works for a legacy media organization really cares what happens to little independent outlets. They just don't. They don't care. They should care, because we were all in that position 10 minutes ago. And small independent outlets are just as legitimate as big news outlets, but nobody cares. And they're not going to care until it happens to someone like an NBC reporter. So that sucks too.
Well, let me ask you also, because last time you were on the show, the subject of Alex Jones came up, and it's been a year since then, and Alex Jones was deplatformed. Again, it's all of these, Silicon Valley giants acting together, which is pretty amazing in itself. I don't know how you get these giant conglomerates to all kind of work together in lockstep. But they deplatformed him. There's also been a pushback against Gavin McInnes. He's actually quit the Proud Boys over whatever was happening there with getting banned from different social media outlets. So what are your thoughts on these right-wing, pretty radical, somewhat insane folks out there also getting deplatformed? Because I know that there's kind of a thought on the left of, these people are spreading some variety of extremism. Alex Jones, I don't know if you just heard him when he was back on Joe Rogan's podcast, but he's, completely gone off the wall. He's talking about how the globalists are trying to open a transdimensional portal in San Francisco. So I mean, it's really insane. So should these media outlets maybe, or social media outlets maybe, work together to get rid of these far right folks, or anybody spreading just fake news or insane claims? Or is that also kind of working to the detriment of the left, where it's just kind of emboldening these systems to eventually act against them?
Look, I'm not obviously not a fan of the political stylings of Alex Jones. He actually has gone after me and on Twitter a few, more than once.
What about?
And even on it, oh, I don't know. He even did a little broadcast, basically calling me an upper class dude or something like that. I forget what it was, but the standard for policing speech, we had a really good system up until pretty recently, and it was a slow system. It took a while, but it was based on the idea that, first of all, you don't police the individual, you police the speech. So if somebody publishes something that's inaccurate, libelous, slanderous, a private person goes to court, sues, wins a big financial reward, and especially if it's a particularly egregious kind of accusation, calling somebody a sex criminal or claiming that they abused our children, that kind of thing can be instantly fatal to a reporter's career. But the whole concept of the system was to try to encourage reporters to do better, right? It wasn't like, we're going to just remove you from the scene forever. We're going to try to keep you in bounds so that we can have more speech and more discussion. So have your messed up, crazy right-wing view if you want, but don't lie. Don't say anything that's going to damage anybody's career or their life. And the whole idea is to have as much speech as possible, err on the side of that, and to have it be based on the individual act. Whereas what we're doing now is we're just saying, well, this person kind of sucks, so let's just not have them anymore. And that takes the entire situation out of the hands of juries, right? Like before, if I made a mistake or somebody said I made a mistake, it had to go to a court, a judge had to hear it, a jury had to hear it, they had to agree before I lost. But now, some idiot in Silicon Valley can just remove you from the platform and that's it. I don't think that's a good system. I mean, I understand what people are saying, but it's just way too easy to see the downside of that, not just for conservatives, but for everybody. And we've already started to see it. And I agree there has to be some kind of way to address bad reporting on the internet, but I don't think this is it. I don't think that's the way.
It does kind of empower them, right? I mean, especially when you have, it's kind of funny, right? Because you have conspiracy theorist Alex Jones, and you have some of the largest companies in the world actually conspiring against him. It's only going to embolden him and his supporters, no?
Yeah, I mean, think about the word. What does the word conspiracy mean? It means to breathe together, and they are breathing together. The CEOs of these internet firms and internet platforms, and they're making coordinated decisions about whom to remove from their platforms, and they're doing it in consultation with the Senate, the Atlantic Council. I mean, who isn't spooked out by that? It's amazing to me. I know I've been sounding incredulous throughout this interview, but it's amazing to me that there isn't more of an outcry about this. And I get it. Most of it is because everybody hates Alex Jones. I mean, who doesn't hate Alex Jones? Who is sane? But you have to be able to look past the person to the underlying principle, and the underlying principle is scary. And I don't get where people are going with this. I don't understand how I don't see it.
Well, my last question is, I really look to you as a great journalist and a great voice of sanity in this insane world. I'm just wondering if maybe you could plug a few other people out there who you admire. I mean, who do you consider the great journalists today?
Look, I mean, the people who I looked up to coming into the business were people like, Seymour Hersh, who's still around. I think Jeremy Scahill's a great reporter. I think, I really like I think Glenn Greenwald he's not a journalist in the same way. That wasn't his training, right? He was more of a pundit before he was a reporter, and he's brilliant at that. Although he's done a lot of great reporting too, and I think he occupies a really important position as somebody who kind of is relentless as a voice and an arguer for sanity and that sort of thing. I look up to him a lot, but as you know, in terms of the reporting aspect of it, you know, the people who I looked up to were all the kind of traditional investigative reporters. A lot of them are unfortunately no longer with us. So I worked for a guy named Wayne Barrett, who was at the Village Voice for years. He was a great muckraker. Robert Parry, who just recently passed away, was another person I admired. But you know, my father, who was a reporter, is somebody I learned a lot from. But the kind of old school way of doing the job is vanishing, and I'm very kind of sad about that. So it's unfortunate. You know, right now when I pick up the New York Times or the Washington Post, or I turn on a network television program, I actually have doubts about the veracity of what I'm reading or seeing for the first time in my life. Like I used to be that I would rely on these people to actually get the facts right, and then I wouldn't maybe agree with their take on things. But now, even the reporting part of it, I distrust, and that's unfortunate. I mean, it's just we're really in a really bad place with the business.
You do have a new book coming out about the media, correct?
Yeah, it's called Hate Inc. It's going to be published by OR Books, and you can I also sort of write books online serially, so you can get that and another book that I wrote last year by going to taibbi.substack.com, and there's a whole thing on there that's kind of like a thing about the media, and that's going to come out soon.
Well, could you maybe just give us a little taste? I mean, what's really either your main argument or just some big part of the book that you might want to mention?
Sure. The main thrust of the book, which started off as kind of a rethink of manufacturing consent. I know you've talked to Noam Chomsky, right?
Yep. Yeah, actually, he's going to also be on Megastar March. I'm going to be flying down to Arizona this week, actually.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah.
Well, please thank him again for me. You know, that book, I thought it would be an interesting idea to go back and kind of look and see how the model held up in the internet and 24-hour cable age. So I started to write it, and then it turned into something else. The book ends up really being about how, in the modern media, we are financially incentivized to divide people. And the reason for that is we're no longer sort of looking to try to get the entire audience. Most news outlets are preaching to one demographic, like a piece of the audience, and they're trying to dominate it. And they do that basically by giving them bad news about the other demographic. So MSNBC and Fox, even though they're completely different in terms of content, they have the same commercial approach, and that has resulted in this very politicized, acerbic, deeply unpleasant media experience that most of us have nowadays. So that's what the book is about. It kind of delves into the history of that and how it works at the reporting level and why it's so hard to combat.
Well, again, Matt, I just want to let you know that you're one of my favorite journalists. I buy copies of the Rolling Stone just to read your reporting. And for folks out there who are interested in this conversation and would like to learn more about you and follow you, where can they go to do that?
www.rollingstone.com for the most part. I'm at Twitter at mtaibbi, and on Substack, taibbi.substack.com.
Well, thanks again, Matt. I appreciate you being back on Primo Nutmeg, especially during Megastar March. It's an honor, and hopefully we can have you back at some point in the future.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on.